Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the next panel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Janet Babin. I'm a reporter at WNYC, and I am moderating this panel, which is Weighing the Balance, how we decide the future of the competing interests of our city. And here to answer all the questions for us, we have our esteemed panel. Of course, New York City Council member Dan Garodnick, and next to Dan is Benjamin Dulchin. He's the executive director of ANHD, the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. And next to Benjamin, we have Afua Atta-Mensah. She's the newly appointed executive director of Community Voices Heard, where she works to promote racial, social, and economic justice and empower low-income communities. And then next to Afua is Garrett. He's the executive director of the New York City Public Design Commission for the last 7 months. Thanks for being here. Well, this is a huge topic, right? I mean, how to decide where our competing priorities should go and how we weigh the balance of our resources. And I thought we would start, though, I think we have to start with the lessons we've learned over the past several years from the current rezoning projects that are underway. And I know prior panels have weighed in on this, but I feel that our esteemed panel has a lot of experience in this area. So I'd like to throw it out there and start with you, Afua. If you could just talk to us about where you think the administration or these pre-zoning projects, about 15 of them, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with some of the names, East New York, Mott Haven, East Harlem, East Midtown. But can you explain where you think we went wrong and where perhaps we went right in doing these rezonings?
Sure. So, I think one of the key issues when we're doing something right is when you have meaningful community involvement, right? Like a participatory process where there's not just an understanding, but a clear commitment to that the affected communities, those residents have, from CVH's point of view, should have the beginning and the end in conversations about what their community is going to look like. And I think we've seen in other rezonings that were tried in the city that failed, one of the things that were lacking was community involvement, right? And when folks are not involved, that helps to breed fear, that helps to have, right, folks having real life concerns about what the trajectory of their life will look like in their neighborhoods. Will they be able to continue in their neighborhoods? Will their families be able to? And so if folks in the community are not stakeholders, but we would say leading the process, right? We tend to feel that the stakeholder can get at times like a little patronized. Clearly they're stakeholders, they live there, right? Like they should be leading the process. You want to lead what happens in your house. Well, I would assume that folks, right, in communities affected by rezoning want to lead processes there. So I think one of the instant things that comes to my mind is that, we've seen what happens when there's community involvement versus what happens when there isn't.
Well, Benjamin Dulchin, to pick up on that, and I should mention that your organization, ANHD, is an umbrella organization of more than 100 nonprofits of affordable housing and economic development groups. You've led successful efforts to reshape key housing policy issues like this very one we're talking about, and the battle started in East New York. Can you talk about what went wrong there?
Well, so I think there are some sort of broad principles that that have really become apparent, right? And so, sort of the title of this conference is sort of about public assets, right? And we sort of think of public assets as being built assets, but I think most New Yorkers would also think that the economic diversity, that ethnic diversity, that cultural diversity, that a lot of what we value in our neighborhoods, is an asset, and that is housing policy and where the city chooses to invest or not invest and how it incentivizes housing or doesn't really shapes that, right? Sort of shapes the preservation of that. And so this issue of the rezonings, particularly of inclusionary zoning, is right at the is right in the center of that struggle now, right? So ANHD, my organization, was actually one of the major proponents of mandatory inclusionary housing. We think it is a terrific policy, and that it is was a major step forward. We argued a lot over the details and didn't. They did not adopt exactly the details of depth of affordability and amount of affordability that we had wanted, but nonetheless, right, this current plan is certainly many steps forward from anything else in the country. But here's the essential problem, right? And this is sort of the contradiction I think that the mayor is facing, that all our communities are facing. So the mayor says there's going to be 800,000 new Yorkers by 2030, right? So simple supply and demand, right? If we don't build more housing, right, including a lot of market rate housing, the overall pressure on the market will increase, and that will be bad for affordability for everybody. There is probably some truth to that, right? Other cities can kind of sprawl their way out of their affordability crises. New York City is a series of 5 islands. We can't sprawl out. But the problem is that where you build that housing and the details of exactly how that housing is built really matters. So the mayor has, chosen to rezone, 15 neighborhoods. Those early neighborhoods are really concentrated in low-income neighborhoods of color that are already experiencing enormous displacement pressure. And so using, Washington Heights as an example, right? There was sort of a struggle around in one individual site in Washington Heights where they wanted to rezone it to allow a developer, who could have built, I think, 100 units to instead build like 350 units, of which 20% would have been affordable. And actually, in this case, genuinely affordable, 40% of AMI, which is not perfect, but it is lower than what usually gets built. The community, a lot of voices in the community said, that's not worth it to us, right? That building market rate housing is not, it's not, the net impact is more than just the value of the affordable units created, that where you're building the market rate housing concentrates and focuses the displacement pressure. So yes, we probably do in some abstract way need more units across the city. That is certainly true. But where they get built, right? You build market rate units in Washington Heights, a neighborhood that over the last 7 years has lost about 5,600 units of rent-regulated housing, where the per square foot price of the privately owned housing has increased 96% as the market has gotten speculative. Where you build it concentrates and focuses secondary displacement pressures. And so it's created this, very understandable, enormous concern in a lot of neighborhoods that really see themselves hanging on by their fingernails, that where that housing gets built and how much of it is affordable and how deeply affordable is not a secondary concern for them. It is a primary concern that really speaks to their ability to stay in the neighborhood.
I remember just the prospect of a rezoning can have an enormous impact on a community, as it did in East New York a couple of years ago. Just hearing that this area was going to be rezoned was enough for developers to swarm the area and to increase land prices. Dan Garodnick, how can we address that going forward? Can we?
Well, obviously, the private sector and entrepreneurs and people who are looking to take advantage of changes in rules that government might make will always think about what possibilities may exist out there. I think that the key is for us to make sure that the rules themselves are sound, so that to the extent that somebody is going to take advantage of them, they will take advantage of them in a way which benefits to the public. That's why mandatory inclusionary housing is so important, and that's why some of the benefits that we are baking into the rezoning proposal in East Midtown are so important. So somebody looks at the zoning resolution and they say, wow, this is actually an opportunity for me. Well, that's actually okay. It's okay because we've set forth some sound, basic rules that benefit the public, reflect our values as a city, allow for residential housing to be built at a variety of different income bands, and in other cases in a commercial district, allow for the rejuvenation of our commercial office spaces. So the idea that somebody would look at it and see an opportunity is fine. But it's incumbent on us as the policymakers and the people who are passing the zoning resolution to make sure that that we've got the right balance in there.
Funny you should say that. I mean, just seeing the Daily News op-ed today and the coverage about East Harlem and the exclusion of certain parts of this neighborhood from the city's mandatory inclusionary zoning, or from the rezonings, was a bit shocking. Dan, do you have any insight into what's going on there?
I think that the key here is if you are going to do a rezoning of a broad area, whether it's East Harlem or East New York, you need to make sure that it's reflective of the community view and priority. You need to make sure that it's consistent with our overall goals for ensuring affordable housing in all of these communities. So, I don't know if I have greater insight to share beyond the editorial, but I do think that, we need to come to a place where we're hitting the right marks, and that's what the zoning resolution is intended to do.
If I can just add, I think, from our standpoint at CDH, this is an opportunity that the administration missed, right? These fears that Ben talked about are not speculative, right? People in Washington Heights have seen their neighbors to the south of them in Harlem and seen the hypergentrification that's happened there. And so for an administration that kind of came through talking about eliminating or being unabashed about fighting back against a tale of two cities, to eliminate a swath of area for rezoning, and we're talking about from, I want to say, 104 to about 96th Street, which would really allow us to capitalize on building units in that area and help to really take a stance against some racial segregation that's happened in the city for too long, is a real missed opportunity. And I think adds to the narrative that this is something that's targeted on communities of color and low-income communities. And I think what goes hand in hand with community input is then listening to that input, right? Or else we've wasted people's time, we've raised expectations and shown that there's not real respect for community demand. So, we're still a part of this process in East Harlem and committed to holding up the community plan, right, as a model for what can happen when you have respectful community inclusion. But for us, right, without real implementation of the community needs, right, the plan and $2.75 get you a ride on a train, right? Like, we have to have implementation of this plan. We have to have real thoughtful ideas about give and take, right? Because I think folks are more sophisticated than they're giving credit for. We know that there's going to be loss of affordable housing. We know that there's going to be an influx of people coming into the city. In fact, a lot of people in these areas tapped for rezoning are doubled and tripled up, right? And would like to take part in getting some benefits of this rezoning. So, we've seen some really good things happen, but there have been some marks that are missed. And, I would encourage folks to kind of take a look at that op-ed today in the Daily News because it points out a glaring missed opportunity.
Justin Garrett Moore, how does design fit into this? Can the public design of certain buildings and structures in our communities, can it be more inclusionary just by the very fact of how we design something? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. And I really would like to dovetail off of some of Afua's comments about that people are more sophisticated than they're often given credit for. So the promise of design and design process really is that it is by nature a way to integrate a lot of complex information, right? Cities have a lot of different layers, a lot of different aspects that need to be balanced consistently. It's how we're collectively using space, our shared space and our common benefits. And this idea of design process incorporating more community voices, thinking about how you integrate complex systems, whether they're issues around long-term environmental sustainability. That's an education process that needs to happen. It's not only talking to people, consulting people, it's also educating and explaining and unpacking complex issues. It's an opportunity through design process, which you start with a blank page and you're adding in constantly layers of information that help you make decisions. So in processes where you have had greater community involvement participation, that you can build the dialogue. We have seen, I think, successful examples of, asking how does my park need to be programmed, right? The Parks Department, they do community meetings and they ask, okay, these are all the different things that could happen in your park. There's people that give their voices and there's sort of like, a pie chart that says, okay, well, this many people wanted basketball, this many people wanted passive space. There's an incredible conversation that happens as a result of that is directly the way that designers and design process works. All right, so that's just one example, but as we look at kind of larger scales, larger systems, we can get into bigger issues. How is transportation going to be improved in my community? And ultimately housing, all of these things that people are talking about. But the process and the idea that in some way everyone can understand design process and get involved in it is very powerful and important.
I should mention that because we're a little crunched for time, we are going to weave in questions throughout our panel. So if you do have questions, please write them down and we'll get them up here and get them answered. But riffing off of design, Justin, I wanted to go back to you, Dan Garodnick, because I think that East Midtown is an example of a place where at first the community was very upset with this plan to rezone. and it ended up being placated and perhaps even welcoming this rezoning. Can you talk about that really lengthy process that you spearheaded?
So it really goes into two different parts. I would say the unsuccessful part and what I would regard as the more successful part. The unsuccessful part was when a rezoning was announced, by Mayor Bloomberg in 2012, just at the very waning days of his administration, and it was a surprise to a lot of people. The principles that he was articulating were very much right. He was right to raise the issues. He was right to identify that our commercial office space in Midtown was aging, getting less competitive, and that our zoning laws were not keeping up in Midtown with other areas, and as a result, buildings were overbuilt, and nothing was really happening over there. But the problem was that it was rushed. There were a lot of outstanding issues. There were some substantive problems with the proposal, which just couldn't get resolved in a very last-minute sort of fashion. I was one of the people who was concerned about that, encouraged him to withdraw the proposal, which he did. In contrast to what we saw then, we have now undertaken a much more complete community process where Mayor de Blasio asked me and the borough president, Gail Brewer, to co-chair a steering committee of all of the various stakeholders in East Midtown to think about what this plan needed to achieve for them. We're thinking about landmarks, you're thinking about the public, you're thinking about workers in East Midtown, you're thinking about the real estate community, you're thinking about transit riders. There's a lot of interest. Everybody has a piece of East Midtown, and every New Yorker identifies Midtown Manhattan as one of their core areas of concern because they use it. So we spent nearly a year with 20+ meetings of hours and hours at a time going through questions about light and air, questions about air rights transfers, questions about historic preservation, and ultimately made a recommendation to the Department of City Planning about what we thought should be the component parts of this rezoning in a way that gave certainty to the public and transit riders in a way that the last proposal did not do, but also gave some certainty to the real estate world because we heard very clearly from them that they don't want to do anything if they feel like they are bogged down in process. The ULURP process for them was, their prime source of challenge in operating or putting together a new development project for a major commercial building in Midtown Manhattan. So what we did was we put the rules, much like we were discussing at the outset in your first question, into the zoning resolution where the public benefits are in the zoning resolution. We worked with the MTA to identify the subway improvements that we want in East Midtown. We're putting them into the zoning resolution. So the public doesn't have to wonder whether or if or when they're going to get a benefit from this proposal, from this initiative. They're going to get it in connection with a development plan. And a developer, similarly, will not need to go through ULURP to ask members of the city council like me what they need to do to be able to earn the approval. We are having that conversation up front. We are developing a whole portfolio of improvements which need to be done. The improvements, should they be done by the MTA? Yes, definitely, but the MTA has a $15 billion hole and a $32 billion capital budget every couple years. These are not their high priority items. If we don't do them, they're never going to happen for the next generation. It's important that we're stepping forward to take action. So the short answer to your question is two processes, one which had a lot of community input and one which did not. And I think we're on a really good path to be able to deliver a positive outcome in the one which people really were thinking about how to make this work.
I do think it's very dicey to give up ULURP rights, but I wanted to move on to some questions from the audience. Displacement is not the only result of building affordable housing or otherwise. How do we weigh concerns about neighborhood character, light, air, views, stressed services, density, things like that? Any particular, does this speak to anyone on the panel? I mean, I'm sure it speaks to all of you, but.
listen, not to beat a dead horse on this one, but I am going to say a proposal where you have real community involvement, where folks are coming together as neighbors and having conversations about this and talking about what's most important to them, right? Part of the East Harlem plan, I'm here mostly speaking about housing, but there were entire sections that talked about a priority for cultural institutions, right? Like Museo del Barrio, right? And the Julio Burgess Center. So there were whole sections about the character of being in El Barrio and wanting to preserve that, about parks, right? About light and space. And so particularly when you have kind of uncommon bedfellows in the room talking about these issues, right? You kind of see that folks want to, listen, this is New York City, so I'm of the mind that everyone's primary is housing. But equally after that, there were conversations about how can we use this rezoning to bring in some needed money for infrastructure in schools, right? To update facilities like public playgrounds and all along up and down on the East Side corridor. So it really provided space to show that cultural institutions, culture of a neighborhood, small businesses were part of a fabric that they wanted to fight for in that community.
And let's identify one of the sources of this challenge, which is that when somebody is doing a new development plan and has to go through a rezoning process and it has obvious impacts to a community on light and air or traffic or whatever, it needs to be studied. It needs to be studied in an environmental impact statement. But there's no requirement that you actually act on it. And as a result, you get a hodgepodge of recommendations in an environmental impact statement, and you're left trying to pick up wherever you can the opportunity to fix some of these things. I mean, we've had, so much development on the east side of Manhattan. There were years in which we had, and in other parts of the city, where there were wait lists for kindergarten. I mean, that's like one of the worst failures in the world for a city when you tell a parent that there's no spot in the local kindergarten for your kid. So we have been pushing to try to do the infrastructure up front so that we can accommodate the development. It shouldn't be reversed, development and infrastructure. It should be infrastructure first, then development. And to the point about East Midtown, that's what we're trying to do there. It's not a residential area, but we are trying to do it there.
But we saw that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to sort of throw in
Yes.
a kind of a complicating factor, right? So, right, clearly, right, sort of the neighborhood voice, right, sort of shaping what the rezoning should be is essential. That is how our government should work at its best. It is complicated because at the same time, right, the concern that we have is that the rezonings are happening inequitably, and that while the city needs to build and that mandatory inclusionary housing is an essential and important tool, that where those rezonings happen and the equitable impact of all of this is crucial. And if you haven't noticed, most of the rezonings are taking place in low-income neighborhoods of color because there's a real power imbalance between neighborhoods that are, sort of poorer end of color and have less social and economic and political capital and those that don't. So, a neighborhood like, Boerum Hill in Brooklyn, right? A lot of political capital there. They would make very strong arguments about light and air and neighborhood character, like understandable and certainly sympathetic, but yet at the same time, if we allow those arguments to not be balanced with the arguments about this overall citywide need to affordability, you're going to end up with just the affordable housing, and sort of the added density and the added burden in the neighborhoods that don't have the political, social, economic power to mediate the process. And so what you need is both lots of neighborhood engagement, but you also need sort of a strong overall citywide plan from our city leadership that says we all have to bear some burden, and as long as it's the right rules that are in place and there is enough affordability and it is inarguably deeply in the city's and the community's interests, we're going to share all of the burden, and that's makes the process even more complicated, but essential.
But it never does seem to be fair, does it? I mean, especially when we hear last week this announcement in East Harlem that certain parts of the neighborhood will be excluded. And I think it's important to recognize, as our audience does, that this is also, in addition to getting some benefits, which you get when you live in the community, you also are going to have to put up with a lack of light, a lack of density, fewer parks. And someone asks, why is the neighborhood rezoning process not using a rules-based approach, as Dan described about East Midtown? And I don't think our panel can answer this, but it is a good question. What happened to a rules-based approach?
Well, interestingly, and I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer that question fully, but I can give a sense as to why there's a difference.
Okay.
In East Midtown, you're dealing with planning for an entire 80 block area, 39th to 57th Street, 3rd Avenue to Madison. Rules-based approach is very appropriate there. You're defining the character of your commercial district. You're putting the importance on transit. You're emphasizing light and air the way that you want the rules to do. You're giving bonuses for pops and things like that. If you're dealing with single one-off development sites in some cases, and that does happen, they're not all just community-wide rezonings, and in some community-wide rezonings, they're just not that big. It could be a more difficult thing to do than what we are trying to do with an 80-block turf in the middle of Manhattan. So, I don't know if your experience bears that out too, but that could be one reason why you may see some differences.
Another question from our audience. Often public voices, particularly people of color, are not heard equally with developers, white people, and et cetera, I guess the establishment. How do we equalize this process? How can financial analysis recognize systemic inequality? This is a question I've been asking for years when I worked at Marketplace, asking that these types of questions and these types of concerns be included in statistical or financial analysis. Justin, do you guys ever consider this when you were making public design decisions?
Well, I think this is a really important issue, and I think the de Blasio administration has, I think, really done a lot of work in advancing this issue, because who is involved and who is at the table is a critical piece of this, right? I mean, don't want to be mean, but look around this room. And we're in New York City, and this room does not look like New York City. There's a lot of circumstances and cases where that's the case, and it is felt systemically in how our cities are planned, designed, built, financed, and everything else. It's just the reality. And there has been a lot of work done on addressing that. So for example, the Department of Design and Construction, the agency that helps procure the services for the design of our public facilities, recently announced its new round of designers, architects that are going to get public projects. So the earlier question about neighborhood character, for example, who's designing the new facilities in my neighborhood, is something that is going to slowly start to change, because the people that are designing those facilities are starting to change. The people that are involved in the decision-making is starting to change. And this is something that, it's a big problem, because it goes into our education system, the pipelines, the access to opportunities. That is, it's a cancer on many ways that our cities are determined. So I think the work is really something that needs to be a collective project and understanding. It's not the job of the government to make a rule and then somehow it's going to get fixed. It's this room, for example. What are you going to do about that?
Engage, yeah.
I think that that's really it's a very deep systemic problem, and it really needs to happen at the level of personal responsibility, of reaching out and engaging with people that have been left out for a very long time.
And I would add, there's also going to be a healthy tension, right? Like, particularly given the federal landscape, right? Like, to me, it makes us laser focused, right, on protecting what's local, right? What's tangible, what you can touch. And, we're organizers, right? So there's going to be times when we're going to be at the table, and there'll be times we're going to be arguing to flip the table over, right? So that we can be heard. And that's the dynamics of this type of tension, right? We play an inside and outside game. Always clear that there's only one thing we care about, which is our permanent interest, right? And I think, particularly given this time, we have to be real clear about grassroots organizing isn't just in the larger political structure, right? It's in how we preserve our neighborhoods. right? And what that looks like, and forcing uncomfortable conversations about even, in these rezoning plans. Where is the conversation about making sure that there is a apportionment from MWBEs, right? So that we are helping the kind of, and being intentional about these shifts in income inequality, right? And what that looks like, and some of these long-term issues. And also a conversation, if we're honest, it's not like it's 100 different people who do these buildings for redevelopment, right? It's like the same 4 or 5 players, right, who are getting a whole lot of subsidies for this over the years during this administration, and making some of these buildings and talking about other leverage that's not legal, right? Not illegal, but I'm saying is a conversation about, I find that folks are quick to throw the progressive mantle on, right? And sometimes we're going to have to make you earn them stripes, right? And CVH is committed to making folks earn them stripes. And sometimes we applaud the administration and understand that they have a Herculean task. And sometimes what steals our allies' spine is being able to say authentically that we'll be outside with 400, 500 people, making you remember, right, why this is important, right? And to your point, but that's going to take allyship, right? Real allyship, and showing up and having those uncomfortable conversations in neighborhoods where there's not a rezoning.
Afua, as usual, brings up a great point. Last week we had an announcement regarding 421A, Benjamin, and as we were talking about upstairs, we have a new administration. And I'd like to ask each of you to comment on how we better answer this question of prioritizing and weighing the balance in light of a new administration in Washington that will likely mean fewer resources for our city.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of, to pick up on your question, so, I mean, I think we're all just beginning to think through what the details, of a Trump administration's actual policies will be. That is a horrifying thing to even say. But
That actually happened? I thought I just...
Wake up. It didn't happen. It's all a fantasy. We've been focused for so long, on just sort of the essential ethical and philosophical unsuitability, un-Americanness, of sort of his approach. We haven't even thought about what the policies are. The policies will be as bad as you can possibly imagine, right? I mean, starting with taking, the Fair Housing Act and throwing it out the window, and then going from there to sort of likely cut, sort of all the sources of federal funding that have been essential to our, our city government having the resources to actually create programs that extend some equity, that have enabled us to be able to have this struggle, right? To have the resources to have this struggle of sort of how they're distributed. And so, it is difficult for us to, we'll need to think through all that. But what it means then is that if we're going to be sort of an island here in New York City, if we're going to be more self-reliant to have the kind of city that we want, it calls upon us even more to make the right decisions and to really get the balance right. So it means that if we are going to be incentivizing development, if we're going to be giving tax breaks to incentivize development, we need to make sure more than ever that we are creating equity with that, right? That we're not leading to the genuine sort of displacement of most people of color and most low-income people to the far margins and beyond of the city, but that we really are protecting the cultural and economic, sort of and community assets of the city. One example of this then is the 421A real estate tax exemption, right, which is a tax exemption which goes to real estate developers who pay no taxes to build new market rate housing, which arguably is not a good policy. The governor announced the governor boxed himself into a bit of a corner because they were trying to sort of get the trade unions and the real estate lobby to kind of agree. And essentially, what the governor has been trying to do for a while, what Albany's been trying to do, is to kind of pay REBNY enough so that they accept a deal with the trades. But it's New York City taxpayer money, and they announced a proposed deal late last week, shrouded by the elections, that would have essentially tripled the cost to the taxpayer of this already useless and inefficient real estate tax abatement, which is about 7% of New York City's budget, and our ability to spend our tax-derived resources on the things that actually matter to our citizens. So all the more reason to get those policies right, because we're going to be on our own for a while.
Well, and they announced it on a Thursday before a holiday. I mean, it was just classic, oh, let's kind of put this under the rug. Oh, we have a deal. Dan Garodnick, what did you think when you heard this?
Look, these sorts of conversations should be had, with full transparency and daylight. We frequently have hearings, multiple hearings on bills in the New York City Council, where we take into account the various thoughts and interests that people have. And by the way, in a way that I think other legislative bodies do not. And we listen. It becomes an important part of the way we shape policy. This one was not a very good example of that. So I think that many of us are now trying to get a handle on budgetary impacts, value of the program, et cetera. But yeah, my reaction was a little bit surprised as to the timing and process, and I think that there's still some open questions here.
Afua, what is the first thing you worried about when you realized that this new administration would be taking over? Was there one project where you were like, I really have to?
So prior to being with Community Voices Heard, I'm a fair housing attorney by trade. So my immediate, just trying to rate my spectrum of what had me in a fetal ball that night. It was just, it was the courts, right, the judiciary. But for our affordable housing work, it's what's the HUD trajectory, right? And what does that mean, particularly for funding truly affordable housing throughout New York State, right, outside of public housing? What does that look like, and what does that mean? And then to really be thinking on the front end, to be meeting with our colleagues in the city and state level to have some real conversations and assessments about what type of money that we'll have to work with, and then having to make some hard choices therein.
Justin, did you fear that you would have to somehow incorporate Trump statues into public design spaces?
Well, to be perfectly honest, yes, right? So end of October, right, Trump had his New Deal for Black America, an urban renewal plan.
Yes, for the African American.
Yes, for the inner cities, right? So he's focused on it in a very bizarre way. And so the impact that level of policy has, urban renewal, right?
Yes.
White man's roads through black men's homes. This has shaped America in many different ways, and federal policies are things that we have to really understand how they're going to land on the ground here in the city. And so the fortunate right of states' rights and local jurisdiction is something that we obviously have to rely very heavily on. New York is very fortunate that it's at a certain scale and political and financial and other powers that it can probably do things that a lot of other cities and communities can't. And so, I'm really more concerned with what's happening across America and not necessarily here in New York. New York is one of the most resilient places on earth. It'll be okay. But the country is a totally different conversation, and that kind of dialogue that New York has with the rest of the country is something that is showing leadership, and people looking to New York is something that I think we should all take very seriously.
We had a question from the audience for you, actually, Justin. How do the agencies, in your purview, sort of balance priorities between themselves when you're making decisions?
Right. It's an incredible process. So, most of you know, New York City government has about 300,000 people just working government, and the silos can be challenging for sure. Different priorities being balanced is very difficult, and that's not even counting the legitimate community or elected officials' kind of concerns that weigh into the decision making. So what has been happening more and more, and I alluded to it earlier, the design process, design thinking is something that people are using more as a tool for working through these issues. Deputy Mayor Shores convened all the agency heads, believe it or not, for a half-day workshop on design thinking, right? So the idea that it was very much from like kind of the human-centered design approach, the citizens are your client, right? They're the end user. How do you connect and relate on those particular issues? So the silos of government may not address someone's legitimate issue of, am I able to get care for my child, right? That crosses agencies. So there is this process of people really thinking about that from the citizen perspective, the user perspective, the New Yorker's perspective. So it's obviously a slow process, but the thinking is there. And people are kind of actively working on these different approaches. And I think the balancing process, it's like anything else, it's a negotiation. There are things that one agency wants and they don't necessarily get it from the other, but the conversation is one that people have in a more, I think, productive way than we had seen in the past.
We are running out of time, so I just wanted to hear from the three of our panelists here after Justin, to talk about if there was one way or one desire of yours in how to improve the way we balance our assets, what would it be, Afua? What will you be working on?
To really give space to having an intersectional approach to the manner in which we're looking at things like design and space, right? I think there's a lot of conversation given to it, but how do we really look at issues, right, of gender, race, and class when we're doing these things, right? And that's sometimes things don't work out to the manner in which we like, but owning it, taking voice in it, and having conversations about some other things that we can perhaps do on the back end to try and rectify and balance those issues.
Benjamin Dulchin?
I guess we're sort of thinking about what the next couple years, like what are the lessons learned from the last couple of years of housing policy, and what are the lessons going forward. I think if there's sort of one thing we think about, it's that, as impressive as this 200,000 unit goal that the mayor put out initially is, and as genuinely inspirational as it is, it ultimately may sort of handcuff them to decisions that keep the units flowing rather than find the right balance. And that, in many ways, the essential tools the administration has are the right ones. It's a matter of finding the right balance, of building the right amount, not too much, the right affordability that's low enough, the right percent of affordable units, and not driving every rezoning inevitably, but really finding the right balance of things. And that if I had one wish, it would be, let's leave aside this 200,000 unit goal, step back and really think what's the right policies, not just what the right number is.
And I think that's largely right, and I agree that you have to make these community by community based decisions, but the balancing is also balancing community interests with the broader city policies too. So you have the community priorities, what's the proper number of units, what's the proper density, light, air, traffic, et cetera, in a particular neighborhood. And then you have the broader city concerns. This is playing out in every corner of New York right now with homeless people and challenges that we have citywide, local community concerns, et cetera. Same thing can be applied to all of these local community decisions. So trying to hit the right mark. There's no real answer to that question other than trying to find the place where everybody can see progress and not face unnecessary opposition.
I just don't think you can talk about it enough, so I think to keep talking about it is the way to go. I'd like to thank our panel so much. Very much.